In the first breath of human history, nothing was promised, not food, not safety, not even tomorrow. Imagine being born into a world where survival wasn't difficult. It was nearly impossible, where out of 200 lives, only one would endure. No cities, no medicine, no protection. Only silence, hunger, cold, and fear watching you from every direction. Every sunrise was not hope. It was a test. Every night was not rest. It was a risk you might never wake up from. Yet somehow, against all logic, against all odds, humanity did not vanish. It adapted, it learned, it endured. And the question is not just how they survived, but how any of us exist at all. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Don't skip it. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a world where your very first breath is a gamble, where the simple act of being born places you in a silent lottery, and the odds are almost impossibly stacked against you. A world where survival is not expected but earned, inch by inch, moment by moment. There was such a time, not marked by kings or crowned by empires, not defined by the rise of nations or the fall of armies, but by something far more primal. This was a time when humanity itself stood on the fragile edge of existence, a time when fewer than 1 in 200 lived long enough to tell their story. This was the world of our earliest ancestors. There were no cities, no laws, no written words to remember the dead, only the vast, indifferent wilderness, stretching endlessly, uncaring whether we lived or vanished without a trace. To be born then was to enter a life of immediate peril. The air itself could betray you. The cold could swallow you whole before you understood what warmth meant. Hunger was not an inconvenience. It was a constant companion, a quiet, gnawing force that shaped every decision, every step. And disease, unseen, unnamed, moved like a shadow through early human communities. A single infection could erase an entire group. There were no remedies, no second chances, only survival or silence. But perhaps the greatest danger was not nature. It was uncertainty. Imagine being born into a world where your parents could not promise tomorrow, where every sunrise was a question, not a certainty, where love existed, but was always shadowed by the knowledge that it could be taken away without warning. Mothers held their children knowing most would not grow old. Fathers taught survival skills not as preparation, but as urgent necessity. Childhood was not a season of innocence. It was a brief window before reality arrived. And still humanity endured. Against all odds, against the crushing weight of that 0.5% survival rate. Some lived, some learned, some adapted, some learned, some adapted. They discovered fire, not just as warmth, but as hope. They formed bonds, not just for survival, but for meaning. They told stories, not in books, but in memory, in gesture, in the quiet passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. Each survivor became a bridge between extinction and existence. And that is the miracle we often forget. Every one of us here today is the result of that impossible chain, a lineage that was never guaranteed. A story that could have ended 1,000 times before it ever reached us. We are not just descendants of history. We are survivors of its harshest chapter. So when we speak of the worst time to be born, we are not merely describing suffering. To be born, we are not merely describing suffering. We are witnessing resilience. We are honoring those who walked through darkness so profound that even survival became an act of defiance. And perhaps that is the deeper truth, that even in the bleakest moment in human history, when survival was nearly impossible, Humanity did not simply endure. It chose to continue, and in that choice, against all odds, the future was born. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. To understand a survival rate as low as 0.5%, we have to strip away everything familiar about human life today and step into a world where existence itself was unstable, where being born did not guarantee becoming anything close to an adult. Early humans lived in an environment where the line between life and death was not a boundary stretched across years, but a thin thread that could snap within hours, days, or weeks. The number is not just a statistic. It represents a reality where for every 200 individuals brought into the world, only one might survive long enough to reproduce, and even that survival was not assured in a predictable or safe way. This was not a world of gradual progress or structured society. It was a world of immediate and constant risk. At the center of this struggle was nature in its most uncompromising form. At the center of this struggle was nature in its most uncompromising form. Early humans were not dominant over their environment. They were deeply vulnerable to it. Climate fluctuations could shift suddenly, turning a habitable landscape into a hostile one. A season of abundance could quickly be followed by one of starvation, where food sources vanished or migrated beyond reach. There were no stored reserves, no agricultural systems, and no guarantee that tomorrow would offer what today provided. Hunting and gathering required constant movement, and every step carried risk of injury, of exhaustion, of encountering predators that saw humans not as thinkers or builders but as prey or competition. Predators themselves were a constant presence in this world. Large carnivores occupied the same landscapes, and humans had not yet developed the tools or group coordination that would later make them apex survivors. Even a single encounter could end a life. Nightfall brought another layer of danger, as darkness removed sight and amplified fear. There was no safe artificial light to extend activity or create boundaries between human space and wild space. The night belonged entirely to uncertainty, and sleep was itself a vulnerable state, where survival depended on group vigilance and fragile shelter. Shelter in those times was temporary and precarious. Early humans might have used caves, simple windbreaks, or makeshift structures made of natural materials, but none of these offered true protection. Weather could destroy them without warning. Heavy rain could flood living spaces. Cold temperatures could lead to hypothermia without adequate clothing or fire. The human body, without insulation or modern adaptation, was exposed to the full intensity of the environment. Even something as basic as maintaining body heat was a daily struggle. Fire, when discovered and controlled, became a turning point, but even fire required constant effort, gathering fuel, protecting it from wind and rain, ensuring it did not die out at the wrong moment. Disease operated silently but relentlessly in this fragile world. Without medical knowledge, infections that are now minor could become fatal. Wounds from hunting, travel, or conflict could become lethal when untreated. Parasites contaminated water and foodborne illnesses spread easily, especially in small groups living in close proximity. The immune system of early humans was not supported by medicine or sanitation, meaning survival often depended on chance rather than treatment. Entire groups could be weakened or wiped out by outbreaks that would today be considered manageable. Nutrition itself was unstable and often insufficient. Early humans depended entirely on what could be gathered or hunted, and success was never guaranteed. A failed hunt could mean nays without protein, A poor foraging season could mean widespread hunger. Malnutrition weakened the body, reduced fertility, and made individuals more vulnerable to disease and injury. In such conditions, even growth into adulthood was not a given. In such conditions, even growth into adulthood was not a given. Children were especially vulnerable, requiring care and resources that were often scarce. The energy required to keep a child alive sometimes competed directly with the survival needs of the group, creating a constant tension between care and scarcity. Reproduction and birth were among the most dangerous moments in this cycle. Without medical assistance, childbirth carried high mortality risks for both mother and infant. Complications that are now easily treated could become fatal. Even when birth was successful, infancy was a period of extreme vulnerability. Exposure, infection, and malnutrition claimed many lives before they could develop strength or independence. The 0.5% survival rate reflects not just environmental danger, but the compounding fragility of every stage of early life. Human groups themselves were small, scattered, and often isolated. This isolation limited knowledge sharing and reduced the safety that comes from larger communities. If one group failed, there was no larger system to support or replace it. Each group was essentially on its own, dependent on immediate environment and collective skill. Cooperation existed, but it was driven by necessity rather than structure. And even within groups, survival pressures could create tension, competition, or difficult choices about resource distribution. Time itself functioned differently in such a world. There was no long-term planning in the modern sense. Survival was measured in immediate cycles, day to day, season to season. Memory and experience were the only tools for learning, passed orally or through imitation. A successful technique or discovery coup, the difference between survival and extinction. But there was no guarantee that such knowledge would persist across generations. The loss of even a few individuals could erase accumulated wisdom entirely, setting survival efforts back to uncertainty. Once again, life in that earliest chapter of human existence was not defined by comfort, ambition, or even stability, but by an unbroken state of uncertainty that shaped every breath, every movement, and every relationship. To exist in such a world was to live without the modern assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. There was no calendar of safety, no predictable rhythm of security, no guarantee that survival was a continuous path forward. Instead, life unfolded as a series of immediate challenges that demanded constant attention, where even brief lapses in awareness could carry irreversible consequences. The idea of planning beyond the present moment was not just difficult, it was often meaningless because the environment itself refused to cooperate with human expectation. In such conditions, loss was not an exception, but a recurring reality. Families did not grow in the way we understand them today, with stable generations overlapping in shared security. Instead, relationships were constantly disrupted by absence. Children could disappear suddenly through illness, exposure, or hunger. Adults could be lost during hunts, migrations, or simple daily survival tasks. Each individual lived with the understanding that attachment did not guarantee continuity. Emotional bonds still formed deeply, powerfully, but they existed under the shadow of impermanence. Love and fear were intertwined because every connection carried the quiet awareness that it might be temporary. There was no system of medicine to intervene between vulnerability and death. Injuries that are now minor cuts, infections, broken bones, could be had. Base, fatal without treatment. The human body was resilient, but not enough to overcome the constant environmental pressures alone. Infections could spread silently, weakening individuals before visible symptoms even appeared. Without knowledge of microbes or hygiene, early humans could not understand why sickness occurred, only that it did. And without understanding, there was no reliable way to prevent recurrence. This created a cycle where illness was both familiar and unpredictable, present in every stage of life, but never fully understood or controlled. Food insecurity was another constant layer of uncertainty. There was no storage system that could guarantee long-term survival. Even when resources were abundant, there was no assurance they would remain so. A successful hunt might feed a group for a short time, but it did not change the reality that the next day could bring failure. Gathering plants depended on seasonal availability, weather patterns, and geographical knowledge that was still developing. Entire groups could experience sudden shifts from relative stability to crisis simply because the environment changed or migration routes altered. Hunger was not occasional, it was structural, embedded into the rhythm of life itself. Shelter, too, was unstable. Early humans did not have permanent homes in the way later civilizations would build them. They moved with necessity, following food sources, water, and climate conditions. Temporary shelters offered limited protection from the elements, but they were fragile against storms, cold, and heat. This meant that comfort was never fully achieved, only briefly approximated. Even rest was uncertain. Sleep could be interrupted by environmental threats or the need for vigilance. The boundary between safety and danger was thin and constantly shifting. Social life existed under these pressures and was shaped by them. C. Operation was essential, but it was not built on abundance. It was built on scarcity and survival. Trust was necessary, but it was also fragile because resources were limited and survival often required difficult decisions. Within groups, individuals had to balance self-preservation with collective survival, creating a constant tension between personal need and communal responsibility. Leadership, such as it existed, was likely fluid and situational, based on skill or immediate necessity, rather than formal authority. Decisions were made quickly, often under pressure, and consequences were immediate. Communication was simple but deeply important. Without written language, knowledge had to be transmitted orally or through repeated action. Every piece of survival knowledge, how to track animals, how to identify edible plants, how to maintain fire, depended on memory and repetition. But memory was fragile. The death of a knowledgeable individual could mean the loss of critical information. This created a world where knowledge was powerful but unstable, always at risk of disappearing. The preservation of survival depended not only on learning but on continuity of people who carried that knowledge forward. Fear was a constant emotional presence, but it was not always paralyzing. It often functioned as awareness, a heightened sensitivity to the environment. Every sound in the distance, every change in weather, every unfamiliar movement carried significance. The nervous system of early humans was tuned not for comfort, but for detection. This constant state of alertness shaped behavior, making stillness rare and vigilance habitual. Even moments of rest were likely shallow, interrupted by instinctive awareness of danger. Despite this overwhelming uncertainty, early humans continued to move forward, not because the world was forgiving, but because survival required adaptation. And within it, there was no separation between living and struggling. They were the same condition. Each day required negotiation with forces far larger than any individual. Climate, geography, animal behavior, resource availability. Nothing was guaranteed and everything had to be earned repeatedly. And everything had to be earned repeatedly. Repeatedly. Stability in any form was temporary and often accidental rather than engineered. Children born into this world grew up without the expectation of long-term security. Their understanding of life was shaped by observation of constant change and loss. Learning was immediate and practical, focused entirely on what could increase the chances of surviving the next moment, the next day, the next season. There was no concept of delayed reward in the modern sense, because the future itself was uncertain. Every skill learned had direct, immediate value, and anything unnecessary was filtered out by the harshness of reality. Even time felt different in such an existence. Without structured systems to mark it, time was measured by environmental cycles, light and darkness, hunger and fullness, migration and stillness. The absence of certainty made the present intensely important. Every action carried weight because its consequences could not be deferred. Mistakes were rarely recoverable, and success was often temporary. Within success was often temporary. The emotional burden of living under such conditions was not expressed in modern terms, but it was embedded in behavior, shaping caution, cooperation, and resilience simultaneously. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Despite the overwhelming weight of danger, uncertainty, and loss that defined early human existence, survival did not happen by chance alone. It was shaped through gradual adaptation, through the slow accumulation of small discoveries that, over time, altered the trajectory of an entire species. In a world where nothing was guaranteed, even the smallest advantage could mean the difference between disappearance and continuity. Early humans did not overcome their environment in a single moment of triumph. Instead, they learned how to persist within it, how to work with its constraints rather than against its overwhelming force. Survival became less about domination and more about endurance refined through intelligence, cooperation, and observation. One of the most transformative developments was the control of fire. Fire was not simply a tool, it was a turning point in human vulnerability. Before its mastery, humans were exposed to darkness, cold, and predation with little defense. Cold and predation with little defense. With fire, they gained warmth in freezing environments, protection against nocturnal predators, and the ability to extend activity beyond daylight hours. It also changed food itself, making it more digestible and safer, reducing the risks of disease from raw consumption. But fire was not easy to maintain. It required constant attention, fuel gathering, and protection from environmental conditions. Its survival depended entirely on human discipline. Losing fire could mean losing safety, warmth, and stability all at once, which made its preservation a communal responsibility. This shared responsibility strengthened coordination within groups, encouraging early forms of collective discipline and cooperation. Alongside fire, early humans developed increasingly sophisticated ways of reading their environment. Survival depended on observation of animal behavior, plant cycles, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. Over time, knowledge accumulated through repetition and memory. Individuals learned which plants could sustain life and which could bring harm. They learned how animals moved, where water could be found, and how landscapes changed across seasons. This knowledge was not written down, but embedded in behavior and passed through teaching, imitation, and storytelling. Each generation inherited not just biological life, but also an expanding library of survival experience. The ability to recognize patterns in nature became one of the most powerful tools for staying alive. Cooperation within groups also evolved as a critical survival mechanism. In a world where individual strength was rarely enough, Collective action increased the chances of success. Hunting, gathering, shelter building, and protection were shared responsibilities. Even though resources were limited, cooperation provided a structure that improved efficiency and safety. Groups that coordinated effectively had better access to food and better protection against threats. This cooperation was not always harmonious. It existed under constant pressure. Scarcity created tension, and decisions about sharing resources could be difficult. Yet, despite these challenges, the necessity of survival encouraged individuals to remain connected. Isolation was far more dangerous than conflict within a group. Communication played a central role in strengthening these bonds. Even before fully developed language systems, humans used gestures, sounds, and eventually structured speech to convey information. Communication allowed knowledge to spread quickly within groups, improving collective survival. The ability to warn others of danger, to coordinate movement, or to share discoveries about food sources increased the efficiency of survival strategies. Over time, communication evolved beyond immediate survival needs and began to carry emotional and social meaning. It became a way to build trust, maintain group identity, and preserve shared experience. This transformation allowed early humans to function not just as individuals reacting to environment, but as interconnected communities responding together. Perhaps one of the most powerful adaptations was the development of storytelling. In a world without written records, memory was fragile. Storytelling became a way to preserve knowledge across generations. But it did more than preserve facts. It created meaning. Through stories, early humans could explain the world around them, transmit survival lessons, and reinforce group identity. Stories about successful hunts, dangerous encounters, or environmental changes became frameworks for understanding reality. They also helped reduce uncertainty by giving structure to unpredictable experiences. Storytelling transformed survival knowledge into something memorable, something that could endure beyond the lifespan of any single individual. Physical adaptation also played a role. Over generations, humans developed traits that supported endurance, flexibility, and cooperation. The ability to travel long distances, to regulate body temperature across varied climates, and to coordinate fine motor skills for tool use, all contributed to survival. Tools themselves became increasingly important. Simple stone tools allowed early humans to process food more efficiently, defend themselves, and manipulate their environment in ways previously impossible. Each improvement in tool-making represented a step toward greater control over survival conditions, even if that control remained limited compared to modern standards. Despite these advancements, survival remained fragile. Every innovation brought improvement, but not certainty. Fire could be lost. Knowledge could be forgotten. Groups could disperse or disappear. Yet what distinguished early humans was not perfection, but persistence. Small advantages accumulated over time, reinforcing one another. Fire supported better nutrition, which supported stronger bodies. Better communication supported effective cooperation. Cooperation supported better protection and resource acquisition. Each development strengthened the next, creating a gradual upward shift in survival probability, even if that probability remained low by modern standards. Migration also played a significant role in survival. Early humans were not static. They moved across landscapes in response to environmental change, resource availability, and climate shifts. This mobility allowed them to explore new regions, adapt to different ecosystems, and avoid areas that became hostile. Migration was risky, requiring navigation through unknown terrain and exposure to new dangers, but it also opened opportunities. The spread of humans across continents reflects this pattern of movement driven by necessity and adaptability. Each migration carried both risk and possibility, shaping the genetic and cultural diversity of future populations. Emotional resilience was another unspoken but essential component of survival. Living in constant uncertainty required psychological endurance. The ability to continue functioning despite repeated loss, danger, and hardship was not optional, it was necessary. While the emotional experience of early humans cannot be fully reconstructed, it is clear that survival required some form of resilience that allowed individuals to continue participating in group life even after experiencing trauma or fear. This resilience was likely supported by social bonds, shared routines, and the stabilizing presence of collective survival efforts. Over time, these combined adaptations, fire cooperation, communication, storytelling, tools, migration, and resilience began to shift the balance, slowly increasing the likelihood of survival across generations. The transformation was not sudden or linear. It was uneven, marked by setbacks and disappearances, as well as progress. But each surviving group carried forward fragments of knowledge and adaptation that would eventually form the foundation for more complex societies. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below.